your knowledge of what's needed when is going to evolve.
That doesn't rely on the flawed perception of a human being.
After those 10,000 models have run, we get a date range.
Are we relying on something that's flawed? Hey, welcome to Dev Better. Today, we're talking about estimates, something near and dear to my heart, with our Director of Engineering here at 7 Factor Software. Hey, Alan, how you doing, man?
I'm great, Jeremy. How you doing?
Good. In your experience, what are some things that you have seen that cause estimates to be wrong?
Yeah, I mean, estimates are wrong because at the end of the day, you're basing that estimate on your current knowledge of the system, how it works, and what your clients need. Whereas that is going to change, that's going to evolve as you build and as you learn new things. And just from a purely functional perspective, as new inputs are added to the system, your knowledge of what's needed when is going to evolve.
Right. And we also talk about entropy as information loss, right? That's another definition of it. And so as we move, again, picture in your head, on the left-hand side, I have my product team. And on the right-hand side, I have my software engineering team. And so entropy can also be defined in the system as a ticket that moves from product through the engineering lifecycle and out into production, which if you have a segregated DevOps team, you actually have a third leg of the stool. That ticket loses information as it moves forward. And as that ticket loses information, we're losing fidelity on exactly when and how that thing is going to be pushed out. So you have this system that's constantly losing information. It's being updated. It's being changed because, again, humans are not perfect. We don't always understand every single ticket that's handed to us, no matter how much time you spend on this, at least in my experience of working with various giant clients for nearly 2 decades now. I've never seen a client get this completely correct. I've never seen a closed system get this completely correct. As a matter of fact, we're starting to design our systems to be okay with this and to allow us to innovate and to drop scope and to add scope, which I would argue adding scope is a trap. Don't do it. But to drop scope in a way that allows the system to continue. But in general, this concept of entropy, I think, and non-determinism is one of the biggest reasons that our estimates are never correct, right? And so next fun question, should we hedge our bets and pad our estimates? Alan, in your experience, what have you seen on the ground with people who do this?
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of places I've worked in the past, hedge estimates, they just add a static, say 20% to the estimate. And the problem with this is it's even that padding that you're adding is non-predictable. Like you have no idea what's going to change in that time frame. So you're already missing the mark if you're adding just a static padding to your estimate. And it never goes well because that estimate, development projects have a tendency to fill the time they are allotted. So even when you are adding a static padding to your estimate, you're going to run up against that deadline. Yeah,
some of the project managers I've worked with in the past have always said, well, every developer has a number, for example. I've actually said this before, where if I say, Alan, how long would it take for you to do X? And I've worked with you for 10 years, and I'm like, well, actually, it's X times a multiple of like 1.2 or some number that, allegedly hedges for that. And in a system that's more waterfall-oriented, that's more iron triangle, PMP, people, process, and time, people, cost, and time style of approach, then hedging can help. But it never completely helps. Instead, what I've found is that hedging tends to set expectations incorrectly because we're saying that I am able to put a high fidelity point on when this thing is going to be done just because I added slop, right? I added a 1.2% coefficient to that estimate. Therefore, I have some amount of confidence that it's going to occur in that time, but it still is wrong. Why do you think it's still wrong? You hit the head. You hit it on the head a little bit, but expand a little bit more on why adding slop doesn't actually produce results.
Yep, because at the end of the day, that slop is static. I think that's the biggest key as to why that's always wrong. Just to call it what it is, it's because that the non-deterministic nature of software is that you have no idea what you're going to run into. So just because you're adding that slop in there, that deterministic padding that you're throwing in there, there is still a significant degree of uncertainty.
I want to talk about another form of slop that perhaps the Agile aficionados are going to throw rocks at me now, so prepare for flame wars in the comments. But story points. The original intention of story points were wonderful, right? The idea of complexity, the idea of a consensus-driven approach to how difficult a particular task was, for those of you who have played planning poker. It's a great idea in theory, but over time, I think what I've seen in systems that implement SAFe and a few other more rigid agile frameworks is that these rituals are reduced to the simple act of taking the total number of story points that I achieved in a week and dividing it by 40. Because what that gets for me, in theory, is the total number of hours it takes to produce a given unit of work. And to me, this is then usually weaponized against the team in a pathological culture. In a generative culture, it's not weaponized, but it's certainly misused in certain ways to try and get a finer point on when we think a thing is going to be done through this concept of velocity. And again, velocity in and of itself is misguided because it's both a leading and a lagging metric, which if I would argue that is ridiculous, that you would ever consider something to be both leading and lagging at the same time. But velocity itself can produce some really bad things in software engineering teams. It can cause us to make the mistake of assuming that because a unit of work per 2 weeks is equal to X story points, therefore I can get Y done at the end of some amount of time. And then we're also throwing in the slop factor, right, of 1.2 times that to get to, again, an endpoint that is feasible by some confidence interval. None of that is scientific. It's still all very sort of thumb to wind, and I think this is going to work. Because if you take the numbers by the numbers, then you'd have to assume that the engineering team is always producing X output. And then we play the games inside the sprint where we take half credit for a ticket or a quarter ticket for credit for a ticket or something like that. So all that to say, the specific estimation technique I want to talk about is assigning story points, right? And I want us to kind of explore this a little bit, Alan. Like, what has been your experience with varying degrees of engineers on the team and sorting out what a complexity value might be in a Fibonacci scale for a ticket?
Yep. So we have a client that we've been working with for a couple of years now, and they do this same thing, and I think broadly across most teams that use some flavor of Scrum, be it or some flavor of something like Safe Agile. A lot of teams do this where they just simply boil down the complexity number, whatever Fibonacci numbers you use, down into days, a number of days. Mm-hmm. What happens is either the engineers, because what I usually see is that the engineer who is going to be working on the ticket is already pretty well known during the discussions, because it's either hitting on some specific technology that this person is really versed in, or some section of the code that they have been working in previously. Mm-hmm. So you usually pretty well know who the ticket is going to. So what that means is at the end of the day, that specific engineer has kind of the final say on how many story points it is. And just by human nature, I think what I've seen a lot of is kind of gamifying the system. And the engineer kind of inflating that complexity a little bit to give himself some room. And again, doing the same thing, adding that slop in there. Or either, hey, I just got done with a really stressful sprint, last sprint, so this week I'm going to build in some extra time to kind of cool off a little bit. And that's just kind of waste in the system. Or the opposite, an engineer is, you have a younger engineer on the team. They're wanting to kind of, for lack of a better phrase, prove themselves. So they kind of lower estimate how much complexity is on the ticket. And then that puts them in a bad spot. The last 2 days of the sprint, they're really stressed out. They're burning the midnight oil to try to get it over the line. So it's a bad and flawed approach all the way around, I think. I think there's a lot of gamifying that happens and a lot of bad habits that come out of that.
So experience in that way matters, right? So let's assume that we're doing complexity, right? And we're assigning a particular ticket, build a login page, right? A fairly straightforward idea. Some people have done it hundreds of times. Some people have never done it before. So you have a junior software engineer on your team. You have a mid-level software engineer on your team. You have a senior software engineer on your team. And you would tell them all, hey, tell me how hard this is, right? The junior software engineer is probably not going to say anything because they're new. Right. And they're like, I'm not committing to anything, or I'm scared to death. Or if they're a little bit more egotistical, maybe they're like, oh, that's like a 3, right? I think that's a 3. The
until senior gives his estimate and then agrees with it.
Exactly. Or that's another, like, confirmation bias, or groupthink, rather, not confirmation bias. Groupthink is a big thing in teams of software engineers, right? Where people tend to defer to the most senior person in the room. And I've seen this in a lot of Scrum implementations that I've worked in, where this exact same scenario plays out. So junior engineer never talks. Mid-level developer who's still learning kind of gives a number that they think is probably about right. So, and usually, these people, because they're not sort of scarred by the system, usually come up with more accurate estimates because they're still kind of new and they've not been working in a target framework for a long period of time. So they're kind of being honest with their actual responses. And then senior software engineers like, I'm just going to inflate the crap out of this because I know that product owner is going to come to me and ask me to change it 15 times. Why are we playing these games is the big question I'm asking us. Like, why are we relying on something that's flawed and does not take non-determinism into account, and that asks an engineer to sign up for something that in a pathological culture would result in them potentially working nights and weekends? Like, why are we doing this? Wouldn't it be better if we just let the work be done? And if we measured how long it took for the work to be completed and we use that in a smart way? I mean, we've invented artificial intelligence. It's a very statistical model that does crazy things with math. Why can't we figure out a better way to predict the future given past experience that doesn't rely on the flawed perception of a human being in the middle of something where they legitimately have something to lose if they are wrong, i.e. their nights and weekends? So let's talk about the psychological impacts of estimates on two actors here. One, the team doing the estimate, and two, the team consuming the estimates. We've talked a little bit about this. We've sort of led up to this question, but let's dig into that a little bit more. Alan, what do you have to say about the psychological impact of an estimate on the team that's doing the estimating?
So on the dev team, the team that's doing the estimating, I think a lot of it boils down to when you put a hard time frame on something, instead of being problem solvers, your engineers become bots with a keyboard, essentially.
Right.
And that kind of instills this specific 9 to 5 mentality of I'm clocking in, I'm doing a job, I'm clocking out. Whereas as engineers, we have this, innate desire to be problem solvers. Give us a hard problem and a keyboard and we'll figure it out. We'll deliver your business so much more value if you just let us solve the problem instead of giving us a specific set of instructions.
Right.
So I think it's just very draining as an engineer to know that I have this specific thing to do and I have 2 weeks to do it, versus I have this problem to solve, deliver the most value to solve that problem. And I think that's the mind shift there that is huge.
Right. And we're not saying that you can't say I need a thing by a date, right? Just to be very, very, very clear here. And we'll talk about this. Yeah. Well,
you can't get away from.
Yeah. We'll talk about this in the next question, but in general, what you're saying is completely true, and it resonates, because if I'm given a stack of papers to pull things off of, it's no secret I'm a fan of Kanban. It's a pull-based system. I like pull-based systems better than push-based systems because, in general, pull-based systems have been proven over time to be more productive than push-based systems, or at least assuming that you're not just pushing work into like a machine, right? That doesn't have feelings or psychology, right? In human systems, pull-based systems typically are better, again, assuming that the engineering team has the best interest of the business at heart. And so if I'm a developer and I've signed up to solve business problems and to write code to do cool things, then when you put me on a team, I'm going to have the best of intentions to walk in and try and do my job and do it to the best of my ability. Not always. There are exceptions to this rule, and that's part of your hiring practices to make sure that you're avoiding, the opposite end of that spectrum. But my psychology, again, if you assume that I'm here to do good work and you assume that I'm here to do good things, then you don't have to take the stick to me and beat me to go and hit a specific deadline, because I'm going to do everything in my power to try and get there. And sometimes this is a mistake that a lot of engineers can even make, even with the best of intentions, where they don't pull the lever, pull the ripcord on the Kanban assembly line and say, hold on a second, I can't get this done. I thought I could, but there's no way this is going to be done by the date that we thought. So I need to have a conversation about that with my product team, which really feeds into a larger vision here that I think people don't think about. And that is, again, as I said at the top of the episode, treat your software engineering team as a complete pipeline from end to end, where product is held accountable for things, development is held accountable for things, and DevOps is held accountable for things, and they're all working together to solve and arrive at some destination. This video is sponsored by us. To continue our mission of providing valuable educational resources to current and future software engineers and tech professionals, we've officially launched the Dev Better newsletter. Our monthly newsletter will bring highlights of the tech industry right to your inbox at the end of every month. Within each Dev Better newsletter, you'll find the top tech news stories, job postings that we believe are worth your time, and more importantly, development tips for your ever-growing knowledge base. If you think this is something you'd read, we've left a link in the description for you to subscribe for free. Now let's get back to the video. So what about the psychology of estimates on the team that are consuming those estimates, right? What do you think about that?
Yep. So most of the time, what I've seen in the organizations that kind of harp on this idea of I need X feature by X date and continually have hard deadlines like that are organizations that are scared of unpredictability. They have to have that predictability. So where we get in a trap is when engineers commit to a specific date, that kind of fear of insecurity causes the business folks to kind of latch onto that date, so that is your end all be all date. That's a hard cut, and they're scared to not hit that date.
Right.
So, and I think it sets us up for failure, kind of like you mentioned at the top of the episode, because that date is unknowable ultimately.
Right.
Yeah.
I think it drives a few things into people. One, it can cause some power trips. Leadership that, again, skews pathological will begin to push incredibly hard and hold people accountable to impossible feats and then blame them for it, which is, again, this is the cycle of abuse that I see in pathological cultures that I'm attempting to highlight here, is that, developer signs up for date, business says, okay, you signed up for date, thou shalt get it done by the date or you're fired. That is a system of fear, right? And some people would argue, well, that's a system of holding people accountable. That's a system that gets things done. That's a, hustle and grind culture approach. And you're right to a degree, but that does not produce the long-term benefits of having a team that enjoys what they do. Because I found that people who like what they do will outrun people who hate what they do and are driven to do it by 100-fold, right? If somebody loves what they do and they come into work every day and they enjoy writing code and they enjoy working on the product that they're working on, they might be completely fine with putting in a little bit of extra time to further the product and to further the mission of the company without you even having to ask them, because they are committed to your vision. Conversely, contrast that with someone that you have beaten with a stick repeatedly and blamed them for it. You signed up for that date. It's your problem. It's your fault. At that point, what you're telling the engineering teams is, I ain't never going to sign up for no date no more, right? My Southern's coming out. F y'all, I'm not doing this. I'm not signing up for anything ever again. I'm just going to sit here and not talk and not speak and leave as soon as I can find another job. So it's important as leaders to look at this and understand. And I had several examples of this in my career where people just don't get it, right? They think that they look at the Elon Musks of the world, and again, he's extremely successful, but they look at kind of that sort of bro hustle grind culture sort of idea, and they think that it produces the results that he got as a billionaire. He got there because he's really freaking smart, and he just has a lot of really good ideas. And he had a team behind him that executed on those ideas, right? It's not this macho man, punch you in the face, do what I say culture. It really is about he produced an idea that made sense and put people and held them accountable, again, in possibly some pathological ways. I don't know the entire story, but that produced in them a drive to go and change the world with like SpaceX and all that. And again, I don't want this to be the Elon Musk episode, but in general, pathological leadership will produce poor results, and it will end with your culture being doomed and thinking in terms of I'm just here to get out, right? I'm leaving this organization as soon as I can.
Exactly.
So that sort of begs the question, should we not estimate ever? Do you think that's the answer?
No, not at all. I don't think we can ever get away from estimates because a business needs some degree of predictability to operate efficiently. So we have to find some happy medium here. We still have to do estimates, but there has to be a way to kind of break the cycle here.
For sure. And so I think I agree that no estimates is certainly not the answer. But I do think that taking something from that movement that I forget the exact time frame in which it came about, but I remember there being a hashtag on Twitter, hashtag no estimates for a minute. But taking those ideas of why are we not estimating, right? You learn from the extremes, taking the ideas that what's the reason behind not estimating? Well, we can never be accurate. I don't think that's the answer. You don't take your ball and go home, right? You have to take what you learned from estimating and feed it back into the system and realize that it's a low fidelity, right? And I think the most important thing here is that I don't think we should be estimating. I think we should be forecasting. And that's different, right? If you think about it in terms of like the weather, right? I'm not estimating it's going to rain today. I'm forecasting it's going to rain today because I'm not certain if it's going to rain or not. The models aren't perfect. They're really good, but they're not perfect. And I think if our industry would just start to think in terms of forecasting versus estimating, and it's a very simple turn of phrase, I think we would have our heads in the right space, right? So
Exactly.
Define forecasting for us, Alan. You guys do this all the time for client estimates and stuff. Talk to us about what that means.
Yep, absolutely. So forecasting for me is it all boils down to communication, like everything in human nature. So what we're doing is we are usually, most of our clients run a weekly cadence. Every week we take the metrics of the tickets that have been completed that week, and we run them to a specific tool that goes through more than 10,000 simulations with varying degrees of randomness each time. And what comes out on the other side is after those 10,000 models have run, we get a date range. We get percentiles. So what comes out is we get a 65% percentile that will complete on this date. We have an 85% percentile that will complete between this date and this date. And then we have a 95% percentile will complete between this date and this date. And what that does is that sets expectations, and that continually fosters that good communication between your business, between your product and your dev people, your dev folks, and that continually just make sure that we're all on the same page. We're all tracking towards the same goals. And if your system is set up appropriately, it allows you to kind of figure out where your pitfalls are, and you can start to see, all right, my estimate or my forecast slipped by X percentage this week. Oh, I can see that's because this ticket took significantly longer. This ticket sat in the system for longer and it was blocked for X number of days. And here's why. We can point it back to exactly why. So I think reforecasting has just proven invaluable just from the sheer communication aspect and making sure expectations are appropriately set. And the whole team is kind of all tracking towards the same goals without that pathological nuance to it.
Yeah, I think the most important thing of what you said is that we're constantly reforecasting. We're
Yes.
not. And again, this is a trap of estimates, is that we do it one time during our planning sessions on Mondays, right? We spend 6 hours if you're in safe agile, good luck. Maybe 1 hour if you're in regular agile. Again, good luck. It depends on how chatty the product team is. But we target one date, we target one amount of work, and we don't ever revisit that. And I get the idea. Like, the idea was rooted in the concept of the Agile Manifesto, and it was rooted in this iterations idea, which came from extreme programming, right? But if you go back and read the docs in extreme programming, or you talk to Kent Beck and you ask him, the conversation is shifted towards the point of an iteration was not to produce a widget. The point of an iteration was to make progress and to iterate towards a goal. And that's the big issue and the thing that we've missed. And all my project management people, I'm sorry, you guys are awesome, but you came from PM and you became a product manager, but you brought a lot of those bad habits of the iron triangle with you, right? And those bad habits have produced in engineers a sense of fear that if we don't hit these dates, we're all fired and we're going to be in a bad spot. And no developer is going to admit that to you, right? Because we're humans and we're going to do a job and we're here to solve problems. But you produced some psychological effects through the forcing of hitting the date that you didn't intend. And so one of the things that leaders have to do is to balance this driving towards a goal and holding people accountable versus driving people away and driving them into the corner where they're going to start defending themselves to try and protect their reputation and to try and protect their job, right? Because that's the first place that I go when I'm told, get this done by this date. I'm going to say, I don't know if I can. Like a smart engineer, again, that middle-level developer that hasn't been scarred by this is going to be, sure, I'll get it done. And they'll stay up all weekend and they'll get it done. Me, as a seasoned engineer that's been around for a while, I'm going to look you square in the face and say, I ain't playing that game. I'm not going to sign up for that nonsense. Like, let's have a conversation about maybe where we can go with this. And I think that's why forecasting is great, because it removes all of the necessity of those conversations. Instead, we look at the week that we spent. We go find the outlier, like you mentioned in your 85%. You mentioned during your conversation that we'll know outliers. We'll see on the graph that after we run these Monte Carlo simulations that, hey, this problem is clear. Like, this ticket took 9 days. And then we could grab that ticket and dissect it and open it up and say, why did this take so long? Right? That gives me more information than I missed my Scrum deadline, after which again I've played lots of games on the big tickets in Scrum. What I see people do is they play this silly game where they ask the developer, well, how much of it did you get done? And the developer's like, I don't know, 50%, 20%, 30%. How the hell are you going to say you got 50% of something done when you don't know how long it's going to take? How does that even make sense? Like, that's not even like math. That's not like real. So, in a forecasting-based Kanban style system, you can go find those big rocks after they've occurred, dissect them, and use them to inform future decisions. But we're so afraid of dealing with that big rock on the outset. And that's the big problem. Like, we have a date, we have a deadline, we got to get to a deadline. If there's a big rock and it skews the deadline, we don't get the feature out on time, we're screwed. Like, we lose this money. Maybe if you're a startup, that is an absolute valid way of thinking, because if I don't get my killer feature out, I am literally going to lose my business. But if I'm a multi-billion-dollar corporation, I could probably afford a little bit of leeway in what I'm doing, right? So I hold my big companies a lot more accountable to this. So forecasting is something that we do, and we really enjoy the fact that it removes the impetus from the engineers having to provide all this extraneous information that always ends up being wrong anyway. So we save tons of time by having our developers not have to re-estimate things. And we, at the leadership level, take that and do the re-estimation for them and hand that to them to inform their process to make them better. That is a true Kanban-oriented system and a true continuous feedback loop that, Scrum-based systems think they've got, but they in fact don't. Again, people are going to argue with me that their Scrum system is perfect, and that's cool. If it works for you, fantastic. But all of the things that I have worked in and all of the teams that I have worked with over the years, I've never seen this done correctly. And even reforecasting is not without its own flaws, right?
For sure.
All right, so let's finish the conversation with what are some of the drawbacks of forecasting. I mentioned that it's not perfect. No measurement system is. Having done this a lot, what are the drawbacks of this forecasting idea?
So there is one of the biggest drawbacks is that there is a hesitation, because kind of like I mentioned earlier, is that businesses thrive on predictability. So there is a hesitation because by default we're giving you less predictability into the system. But this is a compromise between two kind of different systems. So I think the way we usually pitch this, and this usually goes pretty well, is that we relate all this back to kind of extending your analogy earlier about forecasting if it's going to rain or not. We pitch it like a hurricane tracker. Like when you see on the news, you never see a meteorologist put his finger on a map or put her finger on a map and say, this is where the hurricane is going to hit.
Right.
No, it's home. It's a cone of uncertainty. And as that hurricane moves along its path, that cone of uncertainty grows smaller and smaller and smaller because you're using the data of where it has moved in the past and the specific conditions that has caused it to take the turns that it has to more narrowly focus where it's going to go in the immediate future. And that's the way we kind of combat that pitfall of that lessen the predictability in the model there.
Right. It takes a fairly courageous step to embrace something like this, right? And again, I've hated on Scrum a lot, and honestly, it works to a degree, and I don't have a problem with it. We work in it all the time. There are things about it I dislike, which I've highlighted in this episode, but there are things about it that are good. But one of the things that I think it lacks is certainly that level of predictability. We think we have predictability, but honestly, we're having to cook the books to get that predictability. If instead we simply embrace the fact that there is some amount of unknown and entropy and non-determinism in what we're doing, we will get a much healthier system, and we'll be able to use these techniques like forecasting to figure out and hone in on when that particular item will be done. So Alan, thanks for joining me. I appreciate it. If you want to learn more about predictive forecasting, we'll link some material in the description that we've used in the past, and appreciate everybody watching, and we'll see you guys on the next one.